about the work and how it impacts the work that you're doing, whether it's in practice or in studio. So I'm going to share my screen. Give me a moment here. Can everyone see the screen working well? Great.
Yes.
I do want to note that I apologize for any pop-ups that may occur. I've tried to minimize that as much as possible, but my laptop's a little unpredictable. But yeah, so here, I'm here today to really talk about climate adaptive landscapes and the work of SCAPE. Much of our work at SCAPE really falls underneath this category of climate adaptive landscapes, whether we're working on urban shoreline projects or we're working inland, whether we're thinking about large scale projects that span regions or small scale site projects. We're always thinking about climate adaptation because no matter where you are or what site you're working within, all sites are kind of dealing with different variable impacts of climate change, both now and in the future. And so it's very much a core premise of our office and firm is that we focus on thinking about climate adaptation at all scales of work. Just to introduce myself a bit, I hold a lot of different hats and do many different things. I'm speaking to you today mostly from my capacity as partner and design principal at SCAPE Landscape Architecture. You should follow us on Instagram if you don't already, but also just as like a side note, I'm a gardener and also a new insect enthusiast, which is a new recent design interest of mine. And I'm also a member of the Dredge Research Collaborative, which thinks about sediment systems and climate adaptation. And in many ways, all of these different avenues kind of tie together and express themselves differently in the work that I advance at SCAPE. But a little bit about SCAPE. So if you don't know our office, I actually need to update this slide because this year we opened an office in San Francisco as well. So we have offices in New York City, New Orleans, and San Francisco, dealing with three very different water dominant landscapes: San Francisco Bay, the Gulf of Mexico, and New York Harbor. We're about just under around 90 people as an office. And so, much of the work that I'm sharing is really informed and shaped by large collaborative teams and the talented staff at SCAPE. So I just wanted to provide a little shout out to the many people that contribute to this work and the vast collaborations that it takes to advance these projects. At SCAPE, we work and advance a variety of projects at different scales, as I mentioned. We definitely have an expertise and strong interest in urban shorelines and waterfront landscapes. We do ecological planning. Community engagement is really core to our practice, and we try and bring elements of it into all of our projects. We also work at the scale of the pocket park or the school or the plaza, as well as the scale of large scale parks and regional work. So quite a variety of project types. We bring certain kind of core principles to all of our projects. One is a focus on reviving landscape systems. Nadia mentioned her work in Lexington, Kentucky. These are some images from Lexington looking at a naturally occurring landscape system on the right, these karst pools and emergent moments that interact with limestone bedrock as part of the hydrology of the greater bluegrass region. And on the left is what happens when you try and cover that up and channelize it and turn it into a hidden piece of urban infrastructure, is that those landscape systems still exist and they emerge sometimes in unfortunate ways, like this overflowing manhole. And so a lot of our work is about trying to restore and reveal and revive landscape systems which have been either ignored or improperly designed or neglected over past generations. We also think a lot, and I'll talk about this this afternoon, about forging connections between humans and non-humans. So on the screen here are two residents of New York City. On the right, a human volunteer, a human resident of New York City dressed up as a horseshoe crab for a festival in Raritan Bay around our Living Breakwaters project, which I'll speak to this afternoon. And on the left is another resident of New York City. This is in Plum Beach. These are horseshoe crabs mating on the shoreline with the new and full moons in the summer months. And so using the kind of urbanized edges of New York City in a very unique and different way than people and humans do. And so we're always looking to kind of reveal some of these hidden connections and forge stronger relationships and supportive relationships between humans and non-humans. We're trying to generate functional ecosystems with our work, not greenwashed ecosystems. And sometimes this means really embracing and kind of gaining a deeper understanding of what the physical reality of an ecosystem means. We also often think about, as designers, sometimes green things just get photoshopped on a landscape to kind of sell something to a client. But when we really think about creating ecosystem diversity, complexity, and structure, sometimes the realities and the physical expressions of those are a little bit messy or a kind of different aesthetic, like the aesthetic of underwater landscapes, which is something our office is quite interested in. And we also believe that developing ecosystems needs to involve the interaction and engagement with people, that people are a key part of fostering urban ecology. They're not something that's other or outside of the equation. These are some photos of a fuzzy rope weaving evening, a kind of pop-up habitat creation project to spur the growth of different tunicates and mussel species within New York Harbor on a test site, an industrial site with a hard edge. And we had a volunteer event here to gather people at the office to weave these artificial habitat panels together as a community event. And it really brought many people kind of into the dialogue around this experimental project. And experimentation, I think, is really important for us. We don't always know the results of the landscapes that we're creating. And so thinking about working with scientific professionals in the case of the fuzzy rope weaving evening and the habitat panels that you see on the left, we worked with some local scientists at Brooklyn College to study the marine life that grew on these fuzzy rope panels over time. But we pursue projects sometimes simply to learn from them and to apply them to other work. And so developing experiments within your larger scale design projects is something that we find very important. So those are some larger framing principles that we bring to all of our projects. I thought this afternoon to talk about urban shorelines and focus on two projects that really relate to climate adaptation and resilient design. These projects are kind of working, they're both urban shorelines, they're quite different. Urban shorelines are highly contested spaces, often with many different battling and competing interests. For example, horseshoe nesting versus beach use versus urbanization are often in conflict with one another. There are also sites that are changing rapidly, either from an urban perspective, like they might be densifying, or new development might be occurring, or they might be changing from climate change impacts. They might be eroding, they might be suffering from repeat flooding or wave action or land loss. And finally, each of these sites has different but unique ecological potential, that they have a past ecological history that's been somewhat covered up, and we have tried to reveal or revive within our work. And so the two projects I'll feature, one is called Living Breakwaters. It's a project in Staten Island. It's at this point a very long project. I've been working on it for a very long time. It's been in our office for a very long time, and many different generations of SCAPers have advanced and contributed to this project over its different legacies. And a project that we've probably had now for 4 or 5 years in the office, work around the Gowanus Canal in Brooklyn with a variety of clients. So both of these are New York City projects, but I do hope that some of the lessons here are applicable to some of your work more internationally. Okay, so to start, Living Breakwaters is a proposal for the shoreline of Staten Island that really centers on a climate adaptive landscape at a larger scale. This work was inspired by an earlier project that Nadia mentioned in the intro. It was an experimental exhibit project called Oyster Texture. And we actually got the seeds of the idea of this concept of designing with the living material of oysters and the reef building capacity of oyster reefs from going on a small site visit with the New York, New Jersey Baykeeper out to a pilot restoration reef that they were testing, again, an experiment out in the Bay Ridge Flats area, which is an area south of the Gowanus Canal. And so this is an image here of one of their test beds for reef creation within New York Harbor. What they're doing, oysters have disappeared from New York Harbor, you know, around the turn of the century, the past century. And while they still have small established populations in the harbor, their overall population density steeply declined at the turn of the century due to overharvesting, water quality contamination, and dredging, kind of actually physically disrupting and dredging up the oyster beds. And Baykeepers, New York Harbor School, many other nonprofit partners have been focused on thinking about restoring oysters in New York Harbor for many years. And we have teamed with some of these partners to think about how this could be spatially manifested and applied in service not only of ecological habitat creation, but also in service of greater shoreline resiliency to urban shoreline communities. But this was this first moment we kind of encountered some of this restoration work. And what they're doing here is monitoring oysters that were laid out on a small grid of a suspended mesh that was suspended slightly from the seafloor. And they lifted it up, and we're kind of looking at this gooey emergent ecosystem made of all these different agglomerated oyster shells, which are growing on one another and forming a reef. So this was a pretty exciting moment for us to see this work, and it got us really interested in this species of the oyster. We focused on not only the wave attenuating properties of oyster reefs, but also the water quality and filtration properties of the oyster itself as an individual organism, which can take in certain contaminants like plankton or nutrient contaminants and detritus and output filtered water. Not all contaminants, not heavy metals, not all types of remediation are possible with the oyster, but nutrient contaminants can be addressed by oyster populations. And this was just one of the takeaways from this greater oyster texture research and this seems like a really basic takeaway probably for this audience to put forward here and share, but I think sometimes it's important to put these ideas forward, especially for clients, that we really do need to be thinking about the needs of non-humans in our design of cities. So whether you're a developer building a bulkhead wall, or you're a parks agency maintaining a shoreline, we should be thinking about operations, maintenance, and design in relation to species that are not just people, right? And so this work is about bettering the world for people, but also bettering the world for oysters. This is just one of those views of those amazing amalgamated reef structures kind of emerging from this restoration project. And so to really do this, to really think about how do you design for non-humans, you need to consider the life cycle needs of non-human species. And so in this proposal for the Museum of Modern Art, which we titled Oyster Texture, we did a whole process of mapping out and trying to understand the life cycle of the typical urban oyster and how oysters, they start as a sperm and an egg, and they turn into a fertilized egg for about a 2 or 3 week period. This little oyster larva called a spat is free floating within the harbor, and it just gets pushed around by the waves wherever the currents and the waves take it. And then after that 2 week or so period, it attaches to something. And typically it attaches to a material that secretes calcium carbonate. They're slightly attracted to that. They don't have a lot of ability to move themselves around, but if they're pushed by a wave or a current into a little eddy or slow moment where there is a material that secretes calcium carbonate, they will attach to those other surfaces. And so oyster shells are one of those materials that secrete calcium carbonate. And so that is why you get these reef structures of oysters building on oysters, because they are slightly attracted to one another. And so the spat attaches to an existing oyster shell, turns into a baby oyster, and then it grows over time into this larger scale reef system. So that's how the oyster life cycle occurs. We thought about in our proposal for the Museum of Modern Art, which was focused around This was all before Hurricane Sandy hit New York City. This was like in 2009, I believe. And so this exhibition was asking different teams of architects and designers to envision how New York City shorelines might react or adapt to future hurricane and storm threats. It was all very hypothetical at that moment. And we developed this hypothetical proposal that focused on the Bay Ridge Flats, which is where I showed that original picture where the restoration pilot reef was happening, how there could be a whole cycle of restoring and cultivating and growing and farming oysters within the Gowanus Canal after a cleanup process occurred there and paraded out to this flats area and turn into a very large scale oyster reef. That would help protect this neighborhood from storm surge and wave action with future hurricanes. So this is an image of that kind of seed of an idea in a museum. Again, very hypothetical, but really helped us set up some of these important partnerships with organizations like New York, New Jersey Baykeeper, the New York Harbor School, and others really thinking about, how could this actually occur? How could some of the experimental science on the ground inform a larger scale design proposal? So we made a model thinking about this like net-like material being the substrate for the oyster and how that could be deployed out in the harbor here in the distance as this like large scale living reef and blue park that could attract people and be an ecological resource and also help buffer the shoreline. Sandy happened a couple of years later. And so while this was a project, sorry, a couple of these images are very low res. So I think something's happening with my screen, but I think it'll be okay. But so a lot of, the conversations around this project were like interesting and curious, but after Hurricane Sandy, there was a real renewed interest in this type of, I think, pretty innovative thinking around the shoreline resilience concepts of not simply trying to build back what had previously existed before the storm, which was devastating, caused loss of life in so many urban shoreline neighborhoods, both from wave action, from surge, and from all the other associated impacts to our energy system and food system and healthcare system that happened around the storm. But there was a real push to think about design solutions that could help prevent catastrophes of this scale, prevent the scale of damage from a storm like this if it happens again, in a way that would incorporate not only physical risk reduction, which engineers historically have thought about and kind of claimed the field for, but also social resilience and ecological resilience. And so we were invited to participate in a competition called Rebuild by Design, which was sponsored by the Rockefeller Foundation and the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And so it was a nonprofit and a large federal entity coming together to ask design teams to think creatively about how heavily impacted areas during Sandy could be rebuilt and restored better than they previously existed. And so the project that our team led was called Living Breakwaters. And it was a proposal for the South Shore of Staten Island, which was a community that was very hard hit by the storm, didn't have many viable projects kind of on the boards at that moment, like from the Army Corps or others to help protect the community, and was significantly impacted by wave action. And so because of the lessons that we had learned from Living Breakwaters, from Oyster Texture, this museum proposal, some of those scientific partnerships and school partnerships that we had fostered, and some of the engineering lessons that we had learned, we developed this proposal. And it was with a highly collaborative team. Many different partners are involved here. And ultimately, the project was awarded funding for implementation. $60 million of funding was provided by the Governor's Office of Storm Recovery through HUD money. And the Governor's Office of Storm Recovery at the state level is the client for this project as it is moved into implementation. But I'll talk a little bit about the kind of genesis of this project and some of the competition work, and then talk about how it's really landed into the world of implementation and construction. Now we're finally in construction on this project, so that's a big accomplishment. But as I mentioned, this project is really about combining typical notions of risk reduction, of trying to reduce whether it's surge or wave impacts to the shoreline, with cultural resilience and ecological resilience, and think about them all together equally. And to start our process of research and site analysis, it was a really innovative competition because it did have a whole research phase. It wasn't like a typical RFP that kind of tells you what the solution is in the request for proposals. This allowed for an open-ended design process to drive proposals. And I think that's why so many innovative proposals came out of it versus, a kind of repeat of maybe the type of infrastructure that we see in places like New Orleans, levee landscapes. And so we focused in our research on bay landscapes and shallow water landscapes because we had learned with our work on living breakwater, on oyster texture in the museum exhibition, that we could significantly reduce wave action with elements like oyster reefs where there was shallow water, and in deep water this was much less feasible. And so Raritan Bay as a site really rose to the top because it experienced this extreme level of wave action that actually upped the height of the surge in that neighborhood and pushed houses off their foundation and very sadly caused loss of life in that area, and had a very shallow water landscape. This became one of our focus sites of interest. And shallow water landscapes for us are a real mosaic of landscape types. So we began to learn more about this kind of cross section of ecosystems that combines to make the shallows, and thought about a proposal for these sites that was not focused around one piece of singular infrastructure, like a levee that kind of cuts off the relationship between land and water, but thought more about a layered approach of tiered wetlands, upland modifications like vertical elevations of building and higher ground development, combined with offshore interventions like marsh restoration, oyster reef creation, or breakwater creation. And that enabled, that kind of layered dispersed system enabled more interaction and engagement and a culture of resiliency to develop around the waterfront. People live in many of these waterfront neighborhoods because they love the relationship to the shore, whether it's the view of the open ocean or the beach or the marsh. These ecosystems are kind of core to people's cultural identities. And so we wanted to develop a project that would enhance that as opposed to cut people off from the water. This is just some of our analysis from this project, looking at the kind of extent of shoreline change that had occurred, not just within Hurricane Sandy, but also within the greater timeframes. And so this image here on the right looks at historical land loss in yellow along the south shore of Staten Island. The site that we ultimately focused on is down here at the tip, where you can see there's been a lot of land loss. This image here shows an old sewer line that once was a road, which is now part of a beach. So you can just see how much that shoreline has changed over time, which it's important to acknowledge is part of a natural dynamic system, but by urbanizing it, we have artificially fixed it in time. And now we're kind of dealing with the implications of that. And then also we began to project forward future land loss, which became very important for our calculations, that if nothing happened here, what type or what scale of erosion in red might we see in the future? And so this also kind of led us to focus on this portion of the shoreline as a site that was highly susceptible to future land loss over time. And these are just some images of the Staten Island neighborhood of Tottenville, where this project is located, and it's really focused on helping protect these communities or helping reduce risk in these communities. We like to use the phrase risk reduction versus protection because the idea that everyone's fully protected in any scenario is kind of a false idea. If you live close to the water, you bear some risk. And so we're trying to reduce that risk with this breakwater system. But on the top left, you can see some of the streets that dead end on the beach. On the top right, you can see some of the damage from major storms like Sandy, from wave action, the physical force, not just the level of the water impacting structures and homes. And then on the bottom right and left, this was a emergency dune that was put into place, or artificial sandbag, sand trap structure that the it's colloquially called a dune, but not really a natural dune. This was put into place as an emergency measure after Sandy. But you can see it's been pummeled even by more nor'easter like storms on the bottom right. And so you can just see some of the intense wave conditions that exist here. So we focused on this idea or this infrastructure of breakwaters, which are a typical risk reduction engineering technique to reduce wave action in this neighborhood. We looked at submergent and emergent breakwaters that are below and above the high water mark, and thought we were very interested in the system because it reduces the scale and intensity of the surge. It reduces the physical force of the surge with the waves. It breaks that wave action down, creates slower, safer water. But it doesn't cut off the water completely. There will still be flooding if you add breakwaters. It'll just be less intense and less severe. But it does maintain that kind of level of ecological interaction and water flow that shorelines need. And so we advanced this idea. This is one of our competition images, thinking about how we could design breakwaters that would perform these risk reduction benefits to the neighborhood, but also would have different levels of suitability for marine life and bay life embedded within them, both from the subtitle level, thinking about, of course, oysters, because we were interested in that, but we expanded our interest to include juvenile fish and harbor seals and other species of shellfish that live within the harbor. So this whole like cross section or gradient of habitats were thought about and designed as part of this proposal. I'll talk a little bit about that design process because that's just one of my personal interests and passion, this interest in ecology and designing for non-humans in the urban environment. We're interested in ecology for ecology's sake, but we're also interested in ecology because it has positive impacts for the economy. Staten Island used to be a big destination for hard clam, like shellfishing, big hard clam industry. So it's just interesting that it had this historic oyster and clamming economy. Ecology can improve the robustness and function of infrastructure, like biogenic buildup, like barnacles and oyster reef growing on the breakwaters can actually make the breakwaters stronger. And ecology can have very positive impacts for education and engagement, and getting people involved in this project and learning about the risks of living on the shore. And so to think about how we could incorporate ecological principles in this work, we began to work with NOAA and National Marine Fisheries Service to understand what fish species use Raritan Bay, what were there today and what were there historically, and how could we provide more habitat for them within our design work. And so one of the things that we found with this project was that we had the opportunity within Raritan Bay specifically, because where it falls regionally within our harbor and river systems, that juvenile fish were really using Raritan Bay. And so striped bass or patag or other fish species are good examples of this, but there are many fish species that like structure, like the breakwaters can provide physical structure in the water, like little pores and nooks and crannies. So for structure-loving fish, many of them are large as adults, maybe 2 feet, 3 feet, sometimes 4 feet or larger, and they swim up and down the East Coast, right? So they have these huge home ranges, but they often return to their home rivers to spawn. And so they, like in this case, they swim up the Hudson and they lay their eggs far up in the Hudson, further upstate. And those little baby fish use the Hudson as a nursery for about a year or so, and then move to the bay, Raritan Bay, where they hang out in Raritan Bay for another year or so before they're big enough to become ocean adults and survive the large predators out in the ocean. And so this again is one of those lessons around like, not just saying I'm going to design for a fish, but think about what types of fish and what phase in the life cycle your site and your project can really accommodate. And so we began to be very focused on designing for structure-loving juvenile fish within Raritan Bay. And what structure-loving juvenile fish really need and what they had historically is here on the right, these tiny pore spaces within oyster reefs where they can hide from predators. So the scale of an oyster reef and the nooks and crannies that it creates is a perfect scale for little juvenile lobsters and juvenile fish to hide within its crevices, and a big fish can't get in to eat it. But sadly, as many oyster reefs have been lost from Raritan Bay over time, a kind of sandy bottom habitat and flat bottom habitat has emerged, which doesn't have the structural complexity. And so we have thought about how the breakwater system, once it's inserted into the bay, can bring back some of this habitat structural complexity that mimics the oyster reef and hopefully also creates real oyster reefs as part of the effort. But just thinking about using rock sizes that combine to create these pore spaces that are sized to the scale of a juvenile structure-loving fish was a really important design criteria for the project. That was like our super micro criteria. And we also thought about shaping the large scale form of the breakwater to encourage and enhance, excuse me, these different types of conditions that would be beneficial for these species. And so in plan, a typical breakwater is like a linear element that's typically drawn by an engineer. We thought about how we could shape and modify the form to avoid any critical habitat that had been mapped in the area. We didn't want to disturb habitat with this project. When we started this project and design process, we were drawing all kinds of like really large scale, like swoopy shapes for the overall breakwater form. And when we talked to marine biologists, they were like, that looks really cool from your perspective, but like the fish don't care. They can't like recognize that scale of swoopiness or formal modulation. They really encouraged us to think about providing more localized micro scale complexity, both in plan and in section. And so we focused as a team on creating these little protrusions that would extend from the breakwater, as opposed to making like a really wild perimeter shape. We focused on creating a lot of surface area variation in smaller zones that we ultimately called Reef Streets, and I'll show a couple images of that. But that was the effort to create localized, more micro scale complexity. And we oriented that complexity on the waveward side. So we're not creating a lot of complexity on the side where a lot of sediment is settling out and accumulating, because that just fills up all those little holes in that structural diversity. On the waveward side, the waves wash out those holes more frequently, and that structural complexity is preserved. And so these elements, these little fingers that extend, we call reef fingers and reef streets, where small juvenile fish can hide in the breakwater structure in these finger-like protrusions, which are modeled off of local and international examples of reef systems. And then feed, like dart out and feed in the open water of the street, and then dart back in and provide protection and shelter within the reef fingers. We also worked with SCAPE e-concrete to think about alternative types of materials that could be used. So we're using stone in the breakwaters as a core material, but we're supplementing it with an ecological underwater concrete that has a chemical and compositional mix that is better for habitat recruitment underwater. It's also engineered to perform like maritime concrete, which is a much more robust spec than typical concrete. And it has both macro texture. You can see these breakwater units made of e-concrete have these larger holes, and a micro texture, these like tiny holes and surfaces and these little veins kind of moving through it that provide these different scales of hiding spaces and respite spaces for different species. And so here's that image again of this system kind of all coming together. These more linear breakwaters that have the emergent tops that can provide habitat for harbor seals, which are returning to New York Harbor, but these underwater reef fingers, which are on the waveward side, incorporating e-concrete tide pools and breakwater units, as well as different scales of stone to create this micro complexity below grade. And so to also take a step back and, we think about scales through space, but also time scales. This is an image of that oyster and shellfishing economy that once existed off the shore of Staten Island. There was an African-American community on the point of Tottenville that was known as Sandy Ground, which was a really important site for the oyster economy, where a number of different African-American oyster workers came and shucked enormous amounts of oysters. And it was a really big piece of the economic generator of the region at the time. This is an image of some of the leased oyster beds off the shore. So on the map on the top left, these little green areas are historic large-scale oyster reefs. So this area here near Tottenville and the South Shore of Staten Island used to have some of the most extensive oyster reefs in the region. These were called the Great Beds. And they were actually artificially expanded by oyster farmers over time to be larger than the original oyster reef and cultivated. So it was like a whole farming economy happened underwater here. And so these maps just kind of show some of that evolution, that kind of original tonging or collecting oysters within the Great Beds, one at Ward Point, one at Round Shoal. It's interesting when you look at the navigation channel, the historic navigation channels that are still in use today, have this like funky little swoop to them because they were originally designed to avoid the oyster beds. So the beds ultimately died, sadly. You can see it here, how that navigation channel emerged in this era and it moved around the oyster beds. But you can also see how these existing oyster beds were artificially expanded as part of oyster leasing. And this is an image of those oyster workers from Sandy Ground at the kind of height of the oyster economy. But then sadly, all of this, both the economy around oysters and the natural system of the oyster reefs disappeared around the 1900s, 1920s because of, again, this dredging, increased sediment in the water, which suffocated the oysters, and overharvesting and disease, like many different kind of combined reasons, mostly tying back to urbanization. But we were inspired by this history. And so in addition to thinking about how the physical structure of what were the inanimate objects that we're inserting into the harbor, like the e-concrete and the stone, we're also trying to think about this living layer of oysters, which could be fostered on this project over time. And this has been very much in collaboration with a partner called the New York Harbor School, which is a school system, high school and now middle school, that focuses their entire curriculum around engagement with the harbor. And they have a project called the Billion Oyster Project, which emerged after this competition effort to restore 1 billion oysters to New York Harbor, and are a very important partner on living breakwaters. And so we worked with them to identify a variety of ways that oysters could be restored back to the breakwaters. And the systems that we have incorporated in the construction set are, we have oyster gabions that move around the edges. We have these different e-concrete units that have spat on shell and spat on disc inserted into them. So they're kind of like these starter kits for oyster reefs that will grow and agglomerate over time. We also need to monitor the oyster beds with cameras, the breakwaters with cameras, to ensure that no one is illegally harvesting oysters, because you cannot eat the oysters in New York Harbor. The water quality is not at that level. And we also have these little oyster nurseries, or kind of catalyst baskets of hanging spat on shell that will release more oysters into the general water column. So those little baby spat can kind of float around and ideally land on and interact with the breakwaters over time. And so I think a part of this is also really about how people are a critical piece of urban ecology, that this project is designed to help reduce risk to these coastal communities, but it's also designed to engage people. And we thought about trying to engage the younger generation in this work, and identified a whole range of schools that existed within close proximity to the waterfront that could be involved in the creation and stewardship of this project over time. Our graphic design partners at MTWTF developed an oyster gardening manual for the New York Harbor School that they use to help teachers teach Oyster curriculum in their class. And so we actually had a group of harbor school students come out and work with Staten Island educators to think about how they could bring their schools to the shoreline and engage this project over time. And so this work is all about trying to design to enable positive change. You know, this is the Living Breakwaters project is not a replica of a natural system that once existed. It's inspired by that, but it's a whole new thing. It's a whole new type of shoreline infrastructure that's being proposed. But it's trying to acknowledge that we can resuscitate some of that historic life that was once here, but it's going to take a whole different form if it's also going to provide this role of coastal protection in this community. And so this slide is also old. We're like here now, but we are in the construction phase of this project. But I did want to show this full timeline because what I had just shown, the Rebuild by Design competition, was an extremely short piece of the overall project, which has gone on from 2014 to today, and will go on for a couple more years before construction is complete. So, and as the project has grown, the team has grown, the sub-consultants have grown. We have a number of incredibly talented engineers working on the project with us. And while we are prime, because we're helping choreograph these different elements, we certainly could not do it without all of our collaborators' expertise. And so it's somewhat amazing to see this timeline and think about all the work and effort that's gone into it. But also I just find this slide funny because we have our June 2014 competition proposal bird's eye here on the left, this necklace of breakwaters that helps create this protected shoreline and this enhanced shallow water habitat. And then this is the document set from October 2020 issued for construction, the actual configuration of breakwaters that does do these things. So in 2014, this was a concept. And in 2020, this is a fully modeled, both physical model and hydrodynamic model and engineered solution. But if you squint your eyes, they look quite similar, but when you look at the details, they're very different designs here. And so I'll talk briefly about some of the design process of going from the competition design to the reality of what's being constructed. We often focus on single species like oysters or juvenile fish to start and like catalyze our design process and also get the public excited. But ultimately, we're really thinking about much larger assemblages or ecosystems. And so this is some of the work that we did with the regulatory communities of defining these ecosystems and making sure our project was positively impacting these different ecosystems. We also had to think very carefully about how our work would be approved and regulated. And so, some of the regulators, in particular, the Department of Environmental Conservation and National Marine Fisheries Services, initially wanted us to provide examples of projects that had done this before locally, so they could say, yes, we agree this will create habitat. And that's one of the challenges when you're working on an innovative project. If there isn't a built example that you can point to and say, here's the habitat it created, it can be very difficult to get your work permitted, right? There's a incentive, I think, it's safer to say no than yes and stick your neck out for innovation. And so what we ultimately ended up doing was working with our marine biologist team to find structures in the water in Raritan Bay, like these little bug lights and navigational bases that were made of stone that provided some structural complexity. And so we did an artificial habitat survey of these little bug light bases to understand the crevice sizes, the open spaces, and the species that were recruiting there, to use this as proof that yes, introducing this material in the harbor would create habitat. It would create different habitat than what was there, but we also made the historical argument about that historical habitat and trying to bring some of that back and not just have the flat sandy bottom habitat that existed in most of the harbor today. So this was just one of those really interesting processes that we had to kind of go through to, it's not just about design vision, it's about really listening and collaborating with regulators to make sure you're providing the evidence and information they really need to feel comfortable with the project. These are some of the materials we're using in the breakwater. So the design got really refined, it got streamlined, it got value engineered, but it holds these core components of the crest that helps reduce the storm level waves, and these subtidal reef streets that are all kind of optimized at the right elevations, made of a mix of larger scale stone and like bio-enhanced concrete units and tide pools as well. And so these are just some images of those different elements coming together. A huge amount of hydrodynamic modeling went into proofing and understanding the breakwater, as well as shoreline change and sediment modeling to understand how the breakwaters would impact the shoreline. We didn't want to create, a scenario where we were helping build or grow a beach in the area, but it was starving or eroding a beach elsewhere. So a lot of littoral drift analysis was done by engineering partners at COE and OALA. This is some hydrodynamic modeling we did looking at shaping the reef systems, the reef streets and the reef fingers, how wide to make them, what angle to make them. We didn't want to have stagnant pools of water emerge with this work. And then I mentioned in the beginning the importance of experimentation, and this is one of my favorite stories about the project. We have designed the location of all of the ecological concrete units within the project to be statistically viable, like monitoring exercise. And so what that means is that we have a experimental ecological layout for all of our e-concrete units. Some breakwaters have more what we call fish enhancing units. Some breakwaters have more oyster enhancing units. We have a control breakwater that has no ecological concrete units whatsoever on it. And we're going to be monitoring the project over time to see if the reef streets that have these different mixes of these different units do in fact spur habitat for those target species, or if they all use them equally, or if having e-concrete units and not having e-concrete units makes a difference at all. And so this is one of those kind of experiments that like is built into this large scale structure. So you can see here, I think the breakwaters in our plan look like little toothbrushes, but on the bristles of each little toothbrush of the reef streets, you can see some of the different types of experimental ecological layouts that we have. Also, all of our computational modeling was kind of proofed with physical models. And so this is a Canadian facility where we mocked up and modeled the breakwaters, both at the system scale and at the individual breakwater scale. They have different colors on them because each color is representative of a different stone type or material, concrete type within the water. And every stone and every concrete unit is actually scaled down here, not just for physical scale, but also for its weight. And then the waves that are run through this large tank are scaled down to correlate to the scale of wave with the different storm events that the system is anticipated to interact with. And so the reason all the elements are different colors is that once they run the storm on the breakwater, you don't want to see an orange stone emerge in a blue area, right? It allows them to kind of understand, is the breakwater remaining stable and structurally sound? And good news, all the colors kind of stayed in the right place. And so the computational modeling was verified by the physical lab. And so this was just a really fascinating process for our team to be involved in and kind of see from these different perspectives how the design of the breakwater was analyzed and tested. And then at the same time, some of these on-site interventions, like the creation of these kind of floating oyster nurseries and local tributaries and work with the New York Harbor School and local Staten Island schools was all underway from the shoreline side to think about boosting this kind of social and ecological component of the work. These are some educational days that we've done with schools out in the field, and this is some monitoring that a Staten Island school is doing with the Billion Oyster Project to learn more about current water quality within the harbor before the project is under construction. And then here is an image, a very exciting image, not so long ago, I guess earlier this year, for the groundbreaking of the project. This is Kate, my business partner here, kind of introducing the overall project, and one of the first marine mattresses that's like the foundation for the breakwater being laid in the distance with this enormous crane. So it's really quite wild to have worked on this project for so long and now see it kind of actually hitting the water. It was like a water breaking. And so these are just a couple of quick construction views. This is all underway now. The project has a long construction period because it goes on hold for these different ecologically sensitive winter founder mating periods. But these are some images of the e-concrete units being barged out to the site, some of the rocks being lifted and placed on the site. And then one of my favorite pictures, which is actually just a cell phone shot that one of the engineers took out on the breakwater as it was being laid, of a harbor seal kind of hauling out on a stone. So I think no one in our office ever expected to see this image, especially so early. So it's just been a moment of delight that even as the breakwaters are being constructed, they are providing this kind of enhanced habitat for even large creatures, large non-human species, not just the fish and the oysters. So that's where that kind of project is and lives. And I've talked for about an hour, and so I think I might abbreviate my portion of the Gowanus Canal, but I'll still introduce this project. I think Living Breakwaters for SCAPE is a really inspirational project. It came through a really innovative project solicitation mechanism, this design competition that was funded for construction, which is like a designer's dream. And I would love that to be the case for all of our projects, but it is not. It's not the reality of most projects. Many projects are smaller in scale, don't have the generous funding associated with them, don't have the scale or ambition often associated with them. And so I wanted to show and talk a little bit about how some of this work that we've fostered and developed with Living Breakwaters, we translate to different scales of site, both at the more local community scale, a little bit more inland and more constrained shorelines, and also at the individual parcel scale. So I'm going to shift nearby and talk briefly about our work in the Gowanus Canal in Brooklyn, and our plan that we've co-developed with with our client, the Gowanus Canal Conservancy, which is a community organization focused on stewarding the Gowanus Canal, which is shown here in blue, and the watershed around it. And so we developed this large scale plan called the Gowanus Lowlands for this site in this neighborhood. And so much like Living Breakwaters, this area was once a very different kind of condition than it is compared to today's urban condition. The Gowanus Canal was once a large tidal marsh with lots of meanders and wiggles embedded within it. It then became a filled in industrial canal where the edges of that marsh were really squished and compressed and filled in, like in many cities, and turned into a canal that was about 100 feet wide in certain areas, and was used as this very important port and point of exchange for material transport. Like a lot of the brownstone material to build the brownstones today that are beloved in Brooklyn was actually transported through the Gowanus Canal. Lots of heavy industry happened here. Oil and gas plants, manufactured gas plants were here in the top right. Wood storage, gravel storage, material shipping, you name it, it was kind of moved along the Gowanus Canal. And we have this legacy of this industrial landscape today within this neighborhood, kind of post-industrial fabric in the foreground with more residential development in the background, these street ends which abut the canal, and then a canal which no longer has any of those lovely low slope marsh-like ecological edges. It has a really harsh, straight, abrupt bulkhead wall. And so this neighborhood, like many neighborhoods in Brooklyn, is undergoing change for many reasons. One type of change is climate change. So much of the low-lying pieces of the Gowanus, all of these areas are susceptible to sea level rise and inundation with storms. Sandy flooded all of this low-lying ground around the canal, kind of with contaminated water because the water of the canal is not great. There's a big combined sewer overflow issue into the canal. But another point of change is that this neighborhood is undergoing a massive rezoning effort where these industrial parcels are being converted to a larger scale residential buildings, 18 to 22 story towers, which are significantly contributing to helping New York City's affordable housing crisis. And so a very important thing to think about addressing, but also a lot of real on the ground impacts from climate change, sustainability, and environment. The other kind of change element that's happening in the Gowanus is the site was declared a Superfund site because of the level of industrial contamination. And so it's currently undergoing a Superfund cleanup where they are dredging out the contaminated sediment within the canal, rebuilding all the bulkheads as, again, straight, sharp edges, and trying to kind of clean up the waters of the canal, as well as address the combined sewer overflow issues in a moderate way along the edges. And so these kind of different points of change, the Superfund cleanup, the combined sewer control, and the large scale rezoning changes are all really contributing towards a changing environment where the Gowanus as we know it, as this kind of quiet post-industrial wasteland, but also has inspired a lot of art and cultural production, will be kind of changing dramatically in the next 10 to 20 to 30 years with new development, with a cleaned up water body, and with infrastructure improvements. And so the Gowanus Canal Conservancy saw this change happening and said, we need to get ahead of this change. We need to develop a larger scale vision for what could happen here. So as things change, we have a template for what to advocate for. We don't want to be reactionary to all these things. We don't want to stop all these things, but we want to be able to shape them. And so they hired SCAPE to help work with them, to work with the Gowanus Canal Conservancy, this nonprofit community organization, to develop the Gowanus Lowlands Plan to help guide some of this change that's happening underway. And they've done a huge amount of community outreach to kind of understand local priorities, both for not just for the environmental aspects of the project, but also to build greater alliances with organizations advocating for investments in public housing in the area, like the Gowanus Coalition for Justice, and advocating for more affordable housing in the area. And so there's been a multi-year coalition building effort that the Gowanus Canal Conservancy has advanced. And if you're interested in this project, I would reach out to Andrea Parker, who's the executive director of the Gowanus Canal Conservancy. But we helped them set up a process. So the plan is not so much a singular static vision, but it's a process that can evolve over time as the canal changes. And it has these kind of 4 key points of trying to create a cleaner urban ecosystem in the Gowanus, trying to think about stronger community connectors through the neighborhoods, thinking about the canal as a network of parks, and also maintaining some of its qualities as a wild urban waterway, even as it is completely reconstructed and rebuilt. And so I'll flip through these quickly. Again, in this project, we're like looking back to look forward. So this is that map of the historic Gowanus overlaid on the contemporary canal today. So you can see the extent of former marshlands that have been filled in and consolidated. And unsurprisingly, there's a strong correlation between today's hydrology and the future flood risk and those historic wetland areas. So just kind of mapping and describing this was an important part of the process, looking at how it impacted the neighborhood even today in big storm events, and thinking about how a proposal could really improve the street network and the street grid and the way that water was managed in the neighborhood to improve water quality over time. That's a big goal of the project. Regenerating the urban forest canopy. You can see there's a kind of big hole of green within this area because of its industrial nature that can be regenerated as these sites transform. But also how the canal can really respond more to the needs of a very diverse and very vibrant community that surrounds it. It's composed of brownstones and Park Slope and Carroll Gardens, public housing projects in Red Hook and Northern Gowanus, artists and creators that live in work in some of the industrial properties today, and also active industrial businesses along the southern part of the canal, which is not being rezoned and will remain more industrial in character. So this real kind of the combination of community elements coming together. So we worked with different community members to define key corridors that could have or incentivize this Gowanus mix of ground floor activation as part of the rezoning, creating places for artists, industrial fabricators, and community organizations to operate out of, as well as more traditional food and beverage retail. Places where additional connections, community pedestrian connections might be needed to bridge the Gowanus and better connect neighborhoods that have been severed by the creation of the canal. And then really improve the network of parks and productive open spaces that line the canal. These are some of the Gowanus Canal Conservancy's operations today. This is at a site called the Salt Lot, where they do composting and have a native plants nursery. But one of the very interesting things about the rezoning process for the Gowanus is that these are deemed to be waterfront sites. So any type of new building or new structure not only needs to be designed to be resilient to future floods and storms, so many of these sites are being lifted, they also need to create a 40-foot setback of shore public walkway or public space along their perimeter. So the canal previously and today is a somewhat privatized environment with very little public accessible shoreline. But as the rezoning occurs and as Superfund cleanup happens, many more of these parcel edges are going to be open to public access and designed as linear parks. And so the Lowlands vision really focused on a lot of very specific zoning language updates that could occur to enhance those public spaces, to not only have them be 40 feet at their width, but where they intersected with streets, they advocated to pull back those vehicular crossings and create kind of micro pocket parks at these different street end intersections. And also thought about the diversity and the character of the industrial Gowanus expressing itself within these new park designs. Because with Superfund cleanup, a lot of these edges are going to be rebuilt as sheet pile bulkheads. The water is going to be dredged and the land behind it is going to be rebuilt and redeveloped. So just this enormous change is happening. How can some of those qualities and diversity of shoreline experiences of getting down to the water, getting up to have overlooks, actually accessing the water physically, providing points of access, and having a diversity of edge conditions maintain itself within the canal, as opposed to having one long kind of monotonous like bulkhead. Some people kind of compare it to like a steel tub, right? Thinking about the canal purely as like the steel tub. And so the Conservancy has really been advocating this, and we created these different drawings that kind of talk about the range of stepped and graded and planted conditions that could emerge that could help foster this more diverse shoreline edge that still met all the parameters of the Superfund cleanup for environmental health and welfare. And so SCAPE kind of helps stitch this vision together. So some of our just like public renderings and imagery about how these spaces could emerge and the different community uses they could provide and the different ecological benefits they could provide. But I think just like with Living Breakwaters, like establishing a vision was so important, but it's just really one piece of the equation. And thinking about how all of this builds together and how it's implemented and also how it's regulated was a really important kind of next step within the project. Because these sites, some are privately owned, but particularly at these moments that are street ends, you end up with so many agencies overlapping within these spaces, each with their own requirements. It makes the implementation of an idea like a step down, like a potentially insurmountable task, just like coordinating with all the different parties needed to make this happen. And so part of the point of this Lowlands vision was not only to provide a framework for what should happen here, but was to provide a little bit of a roadmap for the different agencies to align their interests and for the GCC to advocate around so that there could be a pathway for actually implementing these types of ideas here within the space. And so that involved just an enormous coalition of businesses, elected officials, government parties, landowners, designers. We did more detailed studies looking at how the actual zoning would inform and could inform the design of these different spaces, develop different ideas for how these shoreline conditions could emerge. But in our research really found that the zoning code as it was previously written and the Superfund regulations really incentivize this, which is like, again, that sheet pile bulkhead wall set at a very high elevation of 14 foot NAVD 88, which is the datum that we use in New York to think about sea level rise and storm surge in this neighborhood. It wasn't that these ideas weren't possible, it was that this was incentivized by the kind of current zoning. And so we had to think experimentally about how to not only put forward a design vision, but again, work with the regulatory community to redesign some of the regulations to incentivize this versus this. And so I'm going to skip through these because I don't want to talk for too long today. But I'll just kind of talk about this image a little bit where like we had proposed this vision, but some of the things that it violated according to the zoning code were like, you know, edges that could get wet in the future was not something that the zoning code really enabled. A pathway that wasn't always at the edge that pulled in and out was something also that was sometimes in conflict with the zoning code. All of our concepts around living shorelines or breakwaters or even sloped revetments or constructed islands were also in conflict with some of the zoning code. Not that they weren't allowed, but they weren't incentivized. So if you were a developer and you wanted to build a small constructed wetland at the edge, the previous zoning code wouldn't consider that part of your 40 feet, and they would make you find extra space to build that. And they would allow you to do it, but it would have to be in addition to providing the 40 feet of publicly accessible area. And so when you provide that alternative to a developer who's very interested in their bottom line, like rarely will they choose to pursue that option. They will choose to pursue the bulkhead option, which satisfies the regulation and gives them the most buildable area. And so we worked very closely with city planning and the Gowanus Canal Conservancy to kind of analyze some existing waterfront sites that were built to code, but were not meeting the needs of our coastal species, whether it's the horseshoe crab or the juvenile fish or the mussel and marsh matrix, right? Like if you have these hard edges and paved sites that are designed solely for people, they're not necessarily providing these other benefits. And we provided a lot of kind of interesting cross sections and ideas for how some of these conditions could be added into the urban environment, like ledges, which previously didn't count as part of our shore public walkway, but we were advocating that this pink area, though it's inundated by water, should be counted and incentivized through the zoning. And I think a really successful outcome of this work, and this is a slide I'll end on, was that in 2021 and early 2022, the rezoning did pass, and it included a number of updates to the waterfront zoning regulations for these Gowanus sites, which included the creation of a community task force to review the design work and hold all parties accountable for kind of meeting the aspirations of the plan. It involved a number of changes and updates to stormwater management, particularly greater investments in combined sewage overflow controls. It also included the inclusion of tidal ecosystems and water access as a incentivized and included piece of that 40-foot offset. So those ecosystems which were once excluded were now included, and direct access to the water was incentivized within the zoning. So this is a big step forward. It also helped kind of shape and define the physical locations of the network of parks that line the canal, and enabled the potential for the creation of a larger parks improvement district to help manage this emerging ecology over time. So I see this as a huge win for the Gowanus Canal Conservancy and a kind of translation of how the design work and the vision also like moved through the regulatory system to help enable positive change. So I think I'm going to end there. These are just some of like the lessons from our work that I extracted from the lecture today, but I hope that was helpful, and I look forward, these are two really different scales and types and contexts of projects, but they both deal with climate adaptation on urban shorelines, and I hope they're relevant to the work that all of you are doing. So thank you so much for your time this afternoon.